There is a moment that most people never stop to examine. A quiet, almost invisible line that exists somewhere between financial stress and financial stability. It has nothing to do with being wealthy, nothing to do with earning more. It begins with $1,000. When you have no financial buffer, your brain does not simply feel stressed. It operates differently. Every unexpected expense, a car repair, a medical bill, a missed shift, becomes a calculation your mind runs continuously, in the background, whether you ask it to or not. Researchers at Princeton and Harvard measured what happens to cognitive performance under financial scarcity. What they found was striking. The mental bandwidth consumed by living without a buffer is comparable to losing a full night of sleep, or, in some measurements, a temporary reduction of roughly 13 IQ points. This is not about intelligence. It is about resource allocation. When a significant portion of your mental processing is dedicated to survival calculations, the resources available for long-term planning, impulse control, and decision quality are measurably reduced. The brain is not broken. It is simply occupied. $1,000 does not solve a financial life. Anyone who tells you otherwise is oversimplifying. What it does, what the research suggests it does, is begin to quiet those background calculations. Psychologists call this a cognitive buffer, a small but real reduction in the mental noise generated by financial vulnerability. When that noise quiets, even slightly, something measurable tends to follow. The quality of decisions a person makes across other areas of their life begins to improve. Not because the money itself produces wisdom, but because the cognitive space that was previously occupied by scarcity is now, even partially, available for something else. Behavioral economists describe a concept called locus of control. It refers to the degree to which a person believes they have genuine agency over the outcomes in their life. Studies consistently show that people without a financial cushion score lower on internal locus of control, meaning they are more likely to experience their circumstances as something happening to them rather than something they are shaping. This is not a character flaw. It is a rational response to a real condition. If every unexpected expense has the potential to derail your entire month, then your environment genuinely does have more power over you than you have over it. $1,000 does not reverse that entirely, but it begins to shift the ratio. It offers the first concrete, tangible evidence that intentional financial behavior produces a visible result. And that evidence, however small, begins to quietly rewrite the internal story a person tells about what is possible for them. Now consider the mathematics. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has documented that the average person who regularly overdrafts their checking account pays over $300 per year in overdraft fees alone. The absence of a small buffer is not neutral. It is actively expensive. Add to that the cost of payday loans, late payment penalties, and stress-driven impulse purchases, and the picture becomes clear. A person without savings is not simply missing the benefits of having savings. They are paying a recurring financial penalty for that absence, and that penalty compounds quietly over time. When the first $1,000 arrives, that cycle begins to change. The overdraft fees stop. The payday cycle loses its grip. The late fees begin to disappear. And because those friction costs are no longer draining the account, the rate at which the next 1,000 accumulates tends to be faster than the first. This is the compounding effect that most financial conversations overlook entirely. Not the compounding of investment returns, but the compounding of behavioral change. One stabilizing decision reduces the cost of living, which creates more margin, which enables the next stabilizing decision. The cycle reverses direction. There is also an identity dimension here that deserves careful attention. Money, at every level, is entangled with the stories we carry about ourselves. A person who has never held $1,000 in savings often carries a quiet internal narrative, conscious or not, that financial stability is something other people have, that saving is for a different kind of life. The first time that balance appears in an account, that narrative encounters a contradiction. And in the psychology of identity, contradictions are not failures. They are the beginning of change. The evidence of the account does something that advice, information, and instruction almost never can. It creates a lived experience. Financial educators who work directly with people navigating scarcity describe the first $1,000 not primarily as a financial milestone, but as a psychological one. It is the moment when abstract concepts become real, when the instruction to save transforms into the memory of having saved. And memories of action are the raw material of behavioral architecture. They shape which opportunities a person notices, which risks feel reasonable, which financial behaviors feel like a natural expression of who they are, rather than a foreign set of rules that apply to someone else. This is what a system looks like at the individual level. Not a dramatic transformation, not a sudden arrival of wealth. A small, quiet, structural shift in the relationship between a person and their financial environment. One that tends, over time, to produce further shifts. At a broader level, it is worth sitting with what this means systemically. A society in which a large portion of the population has no financial buffer is not simply a society with an income problem. It is a society carrying an enormous aggregate cognitive load. Millions of minds simultaneously occupied by the mathematics of survival. The individual experience of financial scarcity and the collective social cost of that scarcity are two expressions of the same underlying dynamic. The friction is not just personal, it is structural, and it operates quietly, at scale, in ways that are rarely named directly. When we talk about financial literacy, emergency funds, or behavioral economics, we are ultimately talking about the conditions under which human cognition functions well versus the conditions under which it is perpetually compromised. $1,000 is not a solution to a systemic problem, but it is a real, measurable improvement in the conditions of one mind. And when conditions improve for one mind, decisions improve. When decisions improve, outcomes shift. When outcomes shift, identity shifts. And when identity shifts, the behaviors that once felt impossible begin to feel, slowly and quietly, like simply what you do. The math is never just about the money. It is about what the money makes possible inside the mind that holds it. $300 in annual overdraft fees is not just a financial cost. It is a recurring confirmation that the buffer does not exist. A signal the brain receives and responds to in ways that extend far beyond the bank account. There are essentially two operating states when it comes to personal finance. Not rich and poor, not successful and unsuccessful, but buffered and unbuffered. The difference between those two states is not primarily about income. It is about the cognitive and behavioral conditions that each state produces. The transition from unbuffered to buffered, from scarcity cognition to cognitive margin, does not require a salary increase, a windfall, or a dramatic life change. It requires, first, understanding what the threshold actually does, and then using that understanding to make the accumulation of that first amount a structural priority rather than an afterthought. Think of it as mental real estate. Every dollar held in reserve is a square foot of cognitive space returned to long-term thinking. It is room to plan, to evaluate, to pause before a decision rather than reacting under the pressure of scarcity. That space is not a luxury. For the quality of financial decision-making, it is a prerequisite. The accumulation of $1,000, however it happens, at whatever pace the real conditions of a life allow, is the construction of that first room. It does not complete the house, but nothing that follows is possible without it. Every financial decision made from a position of scarcity is slightly more expensive than the same decision made from a position of even modest stability. The payday loan exists because the buffer does not. The overdraft fee exists because the margin is gone. The high interest purchase exists because the patience required for a better option has been consumed by urgency. Remove the scarcity, even slightly, and the cost structure of a financial life begins to change. Not all at once, not completely, but measurably. The same income, held within a different psychological and behavioral framework, produces different outcomes over time. This is the quiet power of the first threshold. It does not multiply your income. It does not eliminate your obligations. What it does is return a small but real degree of agency to the person holding it. And agency, in the context of financial decision-making, is worth far more than the number suggests. $1,000 sits at an interesting position on any financial timeline. It is small enough to be achievable by almost anyone with access to even modest disposable income over a reasonable period of time. And it is large enough to produce the cognitive and behavioral shifts that the research consistently points toward. It is the number where financial stress begins to convert into financial space, where the background calculations begin to quiet, where the relationship between a person and their money just begins to shift from one of reaction to one of intention. And that shift in relationship from reactive to intentional, from managed by circumstances to managing them, is not a financial event. It is a psychological one. It is the beginning of a different financial identity. Not wealthy, not free, simply no longer entirely at the mercy of the next unexpected expense. From that position, the next step becomes visible in a way it was not before. The next 1,000 is easier than the first, not because the math changes dramatically, but because the person engaging with the math has changed. The cognitive load is lighter. The behavioral patterns are different. The identity supports the action rather than resisting it. At a systemic level, this is what financial stability is built from. Not dramatic moments of insight or sudden transformations, but the quiet accumulation of small structural shifts, each one creating the conditions for the next. The system does not care about motivation. It responds to conditions, and conditions can be changed. The flowchart of a life without a buffer runs in one direction: scarcity into cognitive load, into poor decisions, into more fees, into less margin, back into scarcity. The flowchart of a life with even a modest buffer begins to run in the other direction. The difference in the starting conditions is $1,000. The difference in the outcomes over time is not. This is why financial education that focuses only on outcomes, on the destination rather than the mechanics, tends to produce limited results. Outcomes are the product of systems, and systems are shaped by conditions. The most important condition to address first is the one closest to the ground, the cognitive and behavioral foundation from which everything else is built. Multiply one person's experience of financial scarcity by millions, and you begin to see the aggregate shape of a structural problem. The cost is not just individual. Every mind consumed by survival calculations is a mind partially unavailable for the kind of long-term, systemic thinking that both individual lives and collective societies require. The system is not abstract. It lives in each decision made under pressure, in each fee paid for the absence of a buffer, in each opportunity not noticed because the cognitive space to notice it was occupied elsewhere. Understanding this is the beginning of engaging with it differently. $1,000 is a small number. By almost any measure of wealth, it is barely a beginning. But within the specific context of what it does to the mind that holds it, within the research on cognitive load, locus of control, and behavioral compounding, it represents something disproportionate to its size. It is the foundation layer, the base of a structure that cannot be built from the top down. You cannot construct genuine long-term financial behavior on top of chronic scarcity cognition. The foundation has to come first, and the foundation begins here. This is not a promise of wealth. It is not a guarantee of any outcome. It is simply an accurate description of what the evidence suggests happens when a person moves from one side of this particular threshold to the other, and why that movement, however small it appears from the outside, tends to matter more than the number implies. The crossing is quiet. There is no ceremony. The account balance changes. The background calculations begin, slowly, partially, to quiet. A small degree of cognitive space opens. A decision gets made slightly better than it would have been made before. And then another. And then another. The number is small. The shift is not. That is the core of what the research points toward, what behavioral economists have documented, and what financial educators working on the ground consistently observe. The threshold is real. The effects are measurable. And the starting point is accessible. $1,000 will not make anyone wealthy. It will not repair a broken wage structure or eliminate systemic inequality. What it will do, what it tends to do within the life of a real person navigating a real financial environment, is change the conditions under which that person makes decisions. And changed conditions produce changed behavior. And changed behavior, over time, produces changed outcomes. That is the system. That is what $1,000 actually does. Not magic, not a shortcut. Just a small, structural, measurable shift in the relationship between a human mind and the condition it has been quietly managing, often for years, without ever being told that the threshold existed, or that crossing it was worth understanding.